I want to take some time today to think about what our response as Christians should be to the issue of immigration. Now, this is a live issue for us wherever we are in the world, of course. And here in the UK, we've had riots in the last few weeks over this issue, and it's been shocking to see the images. Children as young as 12 being arrested, men as old as 70 being arrested, and the outpouring of hate towards Muslims and migrants that have left countless thousands of people in fear of their lives. Now, of course, there is no justification for this violence, but we're naive if we don't recognize that the causes of what we're seeing are complex. And not just here in the UK, but across the whole world, in the US, across Europe and other countries where there is an increasing intolerance of people deemed to be outsiders. Now, ultimately, of course, there are disingenuous politicians and social influencers who are preying on the fears and deep-seated anger of ordinary people who are being manipulated. Ordinary people who quite understandably feel that they are being economically disadvantaged. Ordinary people who feel left behind in society without access to education or jobs or healthcare, who fear what type of world their children are being born into. Ordinary people who, to be honest, feel without hope for the future. Now, these are legitimate fears for people to have. Of course they are. But they're being sold a false narrative that the blame for all of this lies with outsiders, with migrants, asylum seekers, foreign nationals. It's a narrative as old as humanity itself. When things are not going well, we always blame the outsider. But what should our response be to this as Christians? Should we accept this narrative of blame? Or is there a better way to respond to the stranger in our midst? A response that perhaps more clearly mirrors the heart of God? Well, to think about that today, I want to just reflect for a bit on chapter 1 of the Book of Ruth, one of the most beautiful books in the Bible. It's set in ancient Israel before they had kings, during the time of the judges. And it's a really important story for us today because of the social circumstances of that ancient Israelite society, which seem to mirror so much of what is happening in our world at the moment in terms of this suspicion and even hatred of outsiders. But the story of Ruth is a beautiful story about compassion and kindness towards others. And we've got a lot to learn from it today as we think about how we are to respond to outsiders. So let me just briefly recap the story. There was a famine in Judah, and a family from Bethlehem, headed up by Elimelech, had to leave their home and escape to an area called Moab. Now, they became refugees, and they were foreigners in a strange land. And then Elimelech died, and his 2 sons married Moabite women. One of those was Ruth. And they all stayed in Moab for about 10 years, and then Ruth's husband and her brother-in-law also died. So Naomi was now the head of the household, Ruth's mother-in-law, and she decided to go back to Bethlehem. So now Ruth, the Moabite woman, is a foreigner in Bethlehem, and they are so poor and so destitute that she ends up scratching around in the dirt in the fields that have been harvested, picking up bits of grain to live on. And as she does this, the owner of the fields, a man named Boaz, falls in love with her and marries her. And the child they had together was the grandfather of King David, which is partly why her story is so important to us, because Jesus himself is descended from Ruth. So these were difficult years for Naomi and Ruth. Naomi was a refugee. They lived in extreme poverty. And then Ruth becomes a destitute foreigner when she moves to Bethlehem with Naomi. They knew great hardship. They knew what it was to be an outsider as refugees, as foreigners. And we know from the Old Testament that these were difficult days to be an outsider in Israel. The purity laws of Israel forbade intermarrying, and foreigners were seen as the lowest people in society. But for me, here's the interesting thing. When Elimelech moved his family to Moab as refugees, they stayed there 10 years. So it seems that even as outsiders, as foreigners, as refugees, they must have been welcomed in. And Elimelech's two sons married Moabite women, even when their religious purity laws forbade it. And these two Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah, were welcomed into the family, even though they were foreigners, outsiders. So this is a beautiful story of hospitality and welcome for the outsider that runs completely counter to the narrative of society. And then Ruth, this Moabite woman, moves to Bethlehem with her mother-in-law and finds a welcome there. Hospitality and welcome to the outsider is a biblical principle that is written into the history of Jesus' earthly family. And of course, Jesus himself became a refugee when he and Mary and Joseph had to flee to Egypt to escape the wrath of Herod. In these days, when we see so many people fleeing from their homelands, how will we respond with hospitality, love, kindness, and compassion? Now, it's not easy, of course. We see that in Boaz's reaction to Ruth. In Ruth chapter 4, verses 9 to 10, Boaz says, "I have acquired Ruth the Moabite to be my wife." In his mind, he still refers to Ruth like a piece of property. I have acquired Ruth. And he still refers to her as the Moabite, an outsider, a foreigner. So Boaz was conditioned to view the outsider like that. And yet, despite his inbuilt prejudices, he worked hard to see beyond that and meet the needs of this young woman. It would have been hard for him, but he knew it was the right thing to do. And you know, it's not always easy for us to show kindness and compassion to outsiders when we have had years of conditioning inbuilt into us. But the call of Christ on our lives, as Paul says in Romans chapter 12, is for us to be completely renewed in our minds, to see the world in a different way so that we can show love to everyone as our neighbor. So this short story from the Book of Ruth is a story about people who were prepared to step outside their comfort zones, to journey into difficult places physically, emotionally, and spiritually, to defy the conventions of the day in the name of love. This short story from the Book of Ruth is a story about people showing love and kindness, sacrificing themselves, sacrificing their long-held opinions and prejudices for the good of others. The Moabites accepted the Jewish family as refugees. The Jewish family accepted the Moabite girls as daughters-in-law. Boaz, the Jew, accepted the Moabite woman as his wife. So who are you and I called to accept today? Who are the outsiders? Those people whose lives are different from ours, that we are called to welcome in with kindness and compassion and love. These are unprecedented days. We live in diverse societies, people who are different through ethnicity, sexuality, gender, religion, language, and culture. Like the people in this story, each one of us is called to step outside of our comfort zone and show welcome, kindness, hospitality, and love. And not just because it's the decent, humane thing to do, but because we are following the example of our God, who shows ultimate kindness and hospitality to each one of us. All of us have fallen short of God's standards in our lives. And as Paul writes in Ephesians, at one time we were enemies of God, but through the cross of his son Jesus, he has welcomed us into a relationship with him. He has shown each one of us kindness, compassion, and love. And so, having experienced that for ourselves, we are to show kindness, compassion, and love to others. And look how the world was changed by this story of Ruth, this story of love and welcome. Boaz married Ruth. She gave birth to their son Obed, who became David's grandfather, and Jesus was born of the line of David. An act of kindness that quite literally transformed the history of the world. So, how much could we transform the lives of other people by showing them kindness and understanding and welcome? What a wonderful opportunity we have to show welcome to others, to show kindness and hospitality to the stranger in our midst, rather than accepting this false narrative that their presence in our society is the root of all that is wrong. We have the opportunity to model something altogether different. Now, yes, of course, there is economic disadvantage in our societies. Yes, of course, there are complex and deep rooted problems that must be addressed so that everyone has the opportunity to flourish. But let's not buy into this false narrative of blaming the outsider for all the ills in society. Instead, let's reflect the values of Jesus, the values of God the Father. Let's choose to reflect the values of the kingdom of God and welcome the stranger in our midst through kindness and compassion and love.